Here we go. Okay, so I'm talking about revenue, which really ties in pricing and reimbursement. I did take the liberty of talking beyond therapeutics to also include some discussion on diagnostics and medical devices. So for today, just a little background, I'm going to focus on the U.S. market because obviously there's non-U.S. market, which is often very different. Innovative therapeutic life science products, and really I'm talking about value-based pricing, and that's not cost-plus pricing, which sometimes you hear about, and pricing for new products, which we are all dealing with. And important thing to always remember when we talk about revenue is revenue forecast, and what's an acceptable revenue forecast, which will really drive whether or not another party would become interested in your technology, either from a NewCo venture capital standpoint or direct licensing. So revenue forecasts really are demand creation, which we've been talking about here, along with favorable pricing and reimbursement. And a couple key takeaways on pricing and reimbursement. I've been through this a number of times in pharma and biotech world, along with as a consultant on the device world, is that this is a strategy and not a tactic. It's not easy when it comes to establishing a price point, generating adoption, usage, and reimbursement for your product. And it's not formulaic. You need to intimately know your market environment before making any pricing decisions. You have three masters, the payer, provider, and patient. And you'll see that there's a lot of consultants out there who think they have all the answers, and be wary of price sensitivity models and a lot of fancy tools, because it really goes down to really knowing your market and paving a path forward. And it really involves a lot of market research. And one thing I will say, too, is that when you set a price point for a new product, it sends a signal and it forms a perception of your product, and it's hard to change that. So repositioning rarely works. So I think we'd all agree. I'm going to go through a couple of these slides real quickly. Pricing is a top concern for life science companies. Costs are really driving healthcare decisions, especially when we look at specialty therapeutic costs, and we haven't seen anything yet. Wait till gene therapy hits. The $1 million gene therapy in Europe, it's coming our way in the U.S. You've got $100,000 Hep C drugs out there. So we're in a world where we've got to make some tough decisions as a society, and in terms of the healthcare policies that we want to go forward from a government standpoint, private payer standpoint, have to really take into account a lot of different factors in terms of how we're impacting healthcare, and is the value worth it? Is the price worth it for these new products coming out? So we're going to see a continuation of healthcare systems, which are becoming more influential. Specialist hospitals integrate physician practices along with payers. They're going to continue to have the upper hand. So when we talk about managed care payers, they don't infer things. So if we come up with a new product and talk with a Cigna or Aetna and try to get our new drug or diagnostic or device on formulary, and we come up with a value proposition that we think sounds great, and we say, because of this, you can save money, they're going to come back and say, show me the data. How have you done this? Show me a clinical trial how you have improved economic outcomes, or you have improved clinical outcomes, or reduced morbidity, or reduced mortality. And without that, it's very difficult. So no outcomes very much oftentimes equals no reimbursement. Now, here's a case where in oncology, Oncotype DX, well known for breast cancer risk profiling to determine risk of cancer recurrence. Agendia has a product called Memiprint, which very often in the past years was not approved, but here you can see coverage policy based on evidence. So, go ahead and ask questions through the chat room. If anybody has questions or chime in, just please go ahead and stop me. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going through these. So, when making pricing considerations, really are key drivers of medical product development, and the decisions that you make is you look to in the early stages of product planning. When you're looking at which application you want to target, where will this therapeutic be administered? Is this going to be a drug product that's administered by physicians? Could it be self-infused if it's injectable? Does it have to be done could it be done in an outpatient setting, or does it have to be done in an inpatient setting? All have different ramifications when it comes to pricing and what you can price and what you can expect from a reimbursement standpoint if you're a healthcare system. Also, physician targeting, regulatory strategy, all can have an impact on your reimbursement potential. If you're 510K without claims versus PMA with claims could be a big difference, make a major difference. So, pricing too high obviously going to impact your ability to get reimbursement, but it's all really based on pricing too high. What does that mean? It's based on the value perception in terms of either reducing costs or improving outcomes relative to what's currently being done or the current standard of care. So in thinking through a revenue strategy, pricing, and reimbursement, you need to consider all the influencers and decision makers. And so from a marketing perception, from a marketing standpoint, when you drive sales, as a pharma company, you're going to launch with your product, you get approval, you've got a label indication, you're going to have clinical data, you're going to communicate that through Salesforce, medical liaisons, your marketing team, and you're going to impact these key influencers who make decisions, and that really dictates, based on their response, your pricing opportunity. And so when you think of all the influencers, you got to think of your channels, GPOs, group purchasing organizations, contracting, purchasing. You're going to have pharmacy and therapeutics committees, VA, really value assessment, tech assessment committee. So there's a number of steps along the way, a number of boxes you have to check in terms of influencing and creating an opportunity to price at a favorable level to generate adequate revenue to meet your financial targets. This was just in the Wall Street Journal today, kind of interesting, how healthcare provider influence is shrinking and hospital systems are becoming more and more powerful, and to a point where drug companies really promote the healthcare systems or hospital systems now. Hospital administrators are becoming a new target. So how do you develop a pricing and reimbursement strategy? And one of the starting points is the process you're going through now, and really understand your target market and really dissect that market and map out your target segments and determine where your product will demonstrate the greatest value. And it's one thing to have significant unmet need related to your value proposition, but how many people are really not satisfied with current solution to the point where they're willing to make a change? And that's where I think the rubber hits the road, is that circled spot in the bottom here, those folks willing to switch. And so really know your product with all these elements down here, your target customer, compelling reason to buy, what's your product solution? And you really focus on the solution you're providing, which really dictates that value relative to your price. So along the way of determining your target segment of those folks willing to switch, really important to understand what does your target product profile need to look like such that you can position your product to sustain a favorable price point and generate adoption, usage, and favorable reimbursement. And it really goes down to doing a lot of market research, understand what are the drivers to use, what are the barriers to use, and if you look at this grid, what's your unique value proposition? How are you important and different relative to the competition? And that really understanding your target is probably going to be one or two key points that differentiates you from your competition that you have to prove clinically. And with a drug, you're not going to change your API. You may be able to change your delivery system, but how you study it is really going to dictate what your indications are going to be and what you can really promote and how payers are going to determine where your product can be used, and ultimately also how you can price it and generate reimbursement. Understand your burden of illness and cost offsets. In other words, what are the costs of the problem you're trying to solve? So here's a case where worked on a couple of years ago with Clostridium difficile, or infectious diarrhea, where this was an intravenous immune globulin product, so it's a very expensive product to make. You've got generic Flagyl out there and oral vancomycin, which is very commonly used. And we need to see where can we fit in. And in dissecting this market, it really, stemmed down to those severe older patients, where there's high incremental cost relative to hospitalized patients who don't have this condition. So here we've got a product that's going to be used in hospital, so it's going to be under DRG. It's going to be for those patients who may or may not come in with C. diff, but it's complications, so it's sometimes hospital-acquired infection, and $20,000 incremental cost for the most severe patients. And so we kind of came up with an estimate that $3,000 per course of therapy would be fair market price, assuming we're not going to work 100% of the time and leave some money on the table, so to speak. And also the fact that what we charge is not going to be the ultimate price the healthcare system pays. So we'll get into this in a minute about net revenue or net price. But really understand the cost of the healthcare system and the health economic impact that your product will have. Understand how your product can avoid future costs. So if we look at hemophilia, for example, for severe hemophiliacs, for hemophilia A, the therapy is replacement therapy for factor VIII. Hemophilia A is a deficiency of factor VIII. So if people were put on a prophylactic regimen, which is probably the best way to treat these folks, the cost would be $300,000 a year. So the question would be, what would Medicare pay to cure hemophilia and avoid a lifetime of factor VIII therapy? And what's interesting, if anybody knows the hemophilia space, you're probably scratching your head, and if you know the payer space, you're probably saying, why am I looking at Medicare? That's for people over age 65. And hemophilia is a disease of typically thought to be a pediatric condition. But, if you have one-and-done therapy, you realize if we have gene therapy, you've got to look at, not only the pediatric population, but adults with hemophilia. And what's your value proposition for an adult versus a child? So it's a lot of factors that go into play, but think about it. If you could avoid 4 years of prophylactic therapy for a patient who weighs around 60 pounds or more, you're saving over $1 million. Are we at a point where you can charge $1 million for gene therapy and generate adoption and use? So a lot of questions, but going in and understanding how your product can avoid future costs, and also understand how healthcare economics can impact coverage and payment policies. So there's an arcane term called quality-adjusted life years, which is very commonly used in Europe, especially with NICE, the British the UK agency that determines whether or not to approve drugs and looks at the value proposition along with the safety and efficacy of therapeutics before deciding on whether or not they'll be approved for reimbursement. They look at this metric, something that is going to head to the U.S., but we don't currently typically put a price on healthcare, but it's coming our way as we get into this bioethical decision of, do we want to pay $100,000 for hepatitis C drug? Or do we want to pay $1 million for gene therapy? But more and more we see a move in pharma world heading towards orphan indications and specialty therapeutics. So any question along the way? I'm going to pause for a second. So no questions?
No, I think you're doing good.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just talking into my computer.
We're all here.
Not hearing a reaction, so I just want to make sure. So it's also important to determine what you want your product to be in your development regulatory strategy to get there, which really will impact how you can position your product to enact a value proposition. As I mentioned earlier, is this inpatient, hospital outpatient, clinic, or home use? All very different, because you could be in Medicare Part A, Medicare Part B, or Medicare Part C. All have different reimbursement policies. Is this a pharmacy benefit, or is this a medical benefit? Again, very different implications with regards to what you can charge for your product and how a healthcare system views a product in terms of what they're willing to pay. Is this physician administered, and if so, by which specialties? Are you CLIA tests, 510K or PMA? So really know your roadmap and the implications. And it does get complicated because you can have a device that gets reimbursed like a drug. I mean, with the ACL project, that's probably going to go the BLA route, but look like a device. So it's really important to really know this up front and know what that means from a commercial perspective, your regulatory and your product development strategy. And along with that, understand payers and payment mechanisms relative to your product. Who pays and how does this payment happen? Who are the payers? You've got Medicaid for people of low income, Medicare for people over 65, DOD is Department of Defense, 340B for institutions of low income areas. So, a lot of times I hear cases where there's technology that want to target the VA system. Well, you just targeted the lowest price paying institution out there, and they're guaranteed to get the best price by law. Same thing with 340B. So important to understand this, especially when it comes to contracting strategies where, with Medicaid, for example, the government is mandated to get the best price. Understand private payers, managed care, Medicare Advantage, new healthcare exchange plans, payer reimbursement mechanisms. We talk about DRG, CPT codes, ICD-9 codes. I'm not going to get into all these because I know we had a reimbursement talk a few weeks ago. But these are things that as you look to commercialize a therapeutic or device or a diagnostic, you've got to know these and understand who is going to be making the decision. Hospital procurement departments, would it be a P&T, Pharmacy and Therapeutic Committee, Tech Assessment Committee within a hospital, ambulatory surgical centers may have their own committees, payers like Aetna, Cigna have their own policies, and it varies by plan. They have their own formularies, which you really have to understand. And for like for diagnostics and devices, you have to understand billing codes and understand if your product was approved today, could it get approved? Could it get reimbursed under a current code system? And what would that payment look like? And it's often a starting point for determining, what your price range or price band would be for a new product. Understand your channel strategy and commercial model for your product. And this is really important. A lot of people don't think about this, but there's typically a drug company does not sell directly to a physician's office or to a pharmacy or to a hospital. They sell through wholesalers or distributors. And hospitals banded together a long time ago and realized they had power if they formed group purchasing organizations or buying groups. So it's complicated in that these group purchasing organizations will actually contract with wholesalers such that a manufacturer that will sell to a wholesaler who then ships to a hospital under a group purchasing organization contract gets a discount, which means that the manufacturer has to pay a discount to the wholesaler to give them the contract price, and there's a lot of net discounts for prompt pay cash, for working through wholesalers. So, and there's also through Medicaid something called the best price law. So when it comes to revenue, I know this talk's supposed to be about revenue, you've got to think about what's called net pricing, which is very complicated and difficult and probably beyond the scope of this program, but what you price your product out is not your net revenue, is not your net price of what you're going to make as a company. And there's a lot of people who get paid, middlemen who get paid along the way, so to speak, and there's government mandate that they get the best price, such that it's a complicated system and one that probably, if you're developing a therapeutic, you'd license your product out and they would deal with all this, but something just to have an awareness of. But also the fact that there's a push and pull where the group purchasing organization can have an impact on whether or not your product gets used in a hospital. Because hospitals public hospitals have to bid on many things. When it comes to diagnostics devices, if you're on a GPO contract, they don't have to bid. For formularies, very often, you can contract with a GPO and get favorable placement on formularies. Same thing with the pharmacies, online pharmacies. So there's a lot of very complicated system, but one, it's important to understand, pharmacy benefits, hospital benefits, and how that can impact your pricing and net revenue. So developing a pricing strategy. Here's some a good question list to go through. Who you're targeting with your clinical trials. Really impacts who you can sell to, what your indication is, what's your regulatory strategy, what claims will you be able to make. At what pricing level can you develop a reimbursement strategy to support adoption and demand? Because ultimately you're going to have to if you're a company developing a new therapeutic, you've got to justify your pricing, get in front of payers, P&T committees, and pitch your product and say, here's why you need to cover this and put this on formulary. And very often they're going to look at what they're currently doing and say, do we need something new? What's the incremental benefit of this? What's our current, burden of illness or current challenges we're facing? And what's the value add to this new product, or what are the cost offsets? And if you can't answer those questions, you need these folks more than they need you. And without answering those questions, you're not going to be put on a formulary. You're not going to have a chance to even have a ticket to the game, so to speak, so you can play and get a chance to sell your product and generate revenue. Will the reimbursement system enable payment? Which reimbursement pathway should you pursue? Especially for devices, important to understand, could the current codes work, or should you embark on a strategy to get a new code? And when you think about codes, it's kind of more complicated because code just names something, and you've got to think through how do you get a payer to develop a coverage policy to agree to cover your product for reimbursement, and also what's the payment level they're willing to pay if they do have a policy that covers your product. So again, need to know what has to happen to get your drug on payer and hospital formularies, and also can you work with an existing distribution channel or business model? And I'm going to go back to the previous slide. Some of the newer products out there, cell therapy products, have had challenges. For example, Dendreon has a cell-based therapy for advanced pancreatic cancer, which involves apheresis. So you're taking bodily fluid from a patient, shipping it to the company where it has to be processed, then shipped back to the hospital, all in a very short period of time. And so they had to set up a new distribution channel. And something that ideally you don't have to do, but something to be aware of with some of these newer novel technologies and therapies out there in the cell therapy space. And gene therapy once gene therapies hit, we'll have to face some of these challenges in terms of payment systems, payment mechanisms, which have not been established yet in terms of payment over a long period of time. Guarantees. Think about some of these expensive drugs. How many times do you have an expensive product for which there's no warranty? So essentially, there's going to be more and more systems where there's payback provisions if a patient fails or if the drug doesn't meet certain hurdles. So once you develop a strategy, develop an initial price target for your product, it's time to test it with payers. And that's where market research really comes in and understand, number one, how would they evaluate your product? How would they go about doing a review? Would they review it? Would it even be on the radar screen? And also, ultimately, you got to do litmus tests on the price. Because when you get your product on the market, it does involve a great deal of education of payers because these are key decision makers. But before that, you've got to know, how do we educate them? What do we need to educate them on? How knowledgeable are they about the condition for which your product will treat? We were developing a product for critical limb ischemia with a company I worked for a few years ago. Most of the payers we talked to said we don't really come across that very often. So they had no idea to really evaluate it. So develop for devices, really understand your development reimbursement strategy and kind of we call it coding roadmap. Where do you need to go with this, and what's that road to getting? Do you need to get a new CPT code? If so, what are the timing? What does it look like? And something that would just kind of beyond the scope of this presentation. We just have an awareness of this, and ultimately, once a product launches, the product launch plan especially for a therapeutic, it's so mission critical because, and even for a device, because most of these are not reimbursed or on formulary when they launch. And so there's a tremendous educational effort from a medical education standpoint, working with medical societies, key opinion leaders, publication planning and strategies, because you've got to educate and communicate with plan medical directors, hospital administrators, to create an awareness and understanding of your new product clinical benefits and really help them understand how to manage the product. And very often it's a case where products are launched where companies will be very clear, for exactly how to use the product, for which patients it's appropriate and for which patients it's not appropriate, for which specialties, which physicians should be using this, which ones shouldn't, which settings of care should be used, which settings it shouldn't be used. Because typically what happens when a product's launched, for a device, for example, a physician will order it, and they'll call up the patient's insurance carrier and get an authorization, say, hey, will you pay for this? And if they haven't come across this therapy before, typically gets kicked up to a medical director who has to review it. And they've got to say, well, if they're not aware, if they've never seen it before, they'll probably deny and kick it back. So first 6 months or so, there's a lot of manual reviews and case-by-case decision-making. So along the way, that's where education really comes into play, because ultimately, typically what happens is, a hospital or a payer will say, you know what, we keep getting these ad hoc requests for this drug or for this device. We need to just review it. So typically they'll say, hey, has anybody else reviewed it? There's tech assessment committees. There's Hayes and ECRI, different groups that do this on a large-scale basis for multiple hospitals. Or hospitals will have their P&T committee do a review. And that's a positive thing, because that gives the company a chance to step up and demonstrate value if they're invited to the table to present or to provide information. But ultimately, at the end of the game, you want to have a medical policy established where the policy dictates coverage, and hopefully it's favorable, such that you can generate adequate revenue to meet your financial targets. So the Holy Grail in all this is reimbursement and market access. Here's just one example of a product called Dermagraft I worked with a couple years ago that failed miserably when they launched, and they did a relaunch and were able to come up with a number of prospective studies, and they actually more than doubled their price and were able to dramatically increase their access through different payers, and to a point where 100% of Medicare lives are covered with this Dermagraft treatment. So coming up to 4:30, any questions, comments?
I guess, Tom, this is Tim Cornell. One question I do have is, this seems like almost an overwhelming amount of kind of data to get your hands around. Where are resources as we start to look into some of this, mainly the market that's out there and where to move, in that market, and looking at these streams of revenue and those aspects of things, where do we go for this information?
Where do you go for this information? As far as understanding your market, or understanding, there's a variety.
Well, understanding more the details of how do you get your market into the hands of the users, and how do you, and I guess I'm looking at a little more for details of Do you go directly to some of the groups that you talked about? Do you and do you do this at a parallel time as you're establishing the clinical utility of your device?
I think you do, and there's a lot of iterative back and forth. I mean, again, it's important. I'll start back with this slide here. Really understand, your market. It all boils down to, where is that really big problem where people are willing to switch or make a change, and really understand your unique value proposition relative to that problem. How are you going to solve that problem, and quantify what does that mean when you solve a problem? Are you decreasing morbidity? What morbidity? Are you decreasing mortality? Are you going to eliminate the need for patients to require factor VIII infusions, or take them from a severe hemophiliac to a mild or to a moderate or mild hemophiliac, which means reduces consumption? What does that mean? And I think then you can really start to better understand and quantify what your value is for your product, because that's what the people who make the decisions of whether or not to use your product are going to do. So it's important for the company or the entrepreneur developing the product to really have an eye for this and understand, where do we develop this? This product for the C. difficile project was very early stage, but we had to be very clear in terms of, is it even worth it? I mean, could we have a price point that's profitable and that works your NPV is net present value? And is it even feasible to go forward with this? And lo and behold, I found a lot of good data in the literature on incremental cost for nosocomial infections related to C. diff. And based on that also, we were able to quantify the market size. So we target everybody with C. diff. We're very clear, this is going to be used in hospital, and this is typically what their costs are. So I think ultimately you're never going to do this, but you're going to have to convince, ultimately, if you're a therapeutic, especially, another company to take this on, spend a lot of money, invest in this to bring it to market, and they're ultimately going to execute the strategy. But it's important to really understand, as you develop this, where you're developing this, for which indication, and are you targeting those indications for which you have a viable value proposition that can sustain a price point to extract adequate revenue.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that helps.
Tom, before you move on here, I'd like a quick question. You mentioned in this slide in particular that you settled on a $3,000 per course price. How much do you decide to leave on the table as an incentive for switching? Is there a formula for that, or is it something you just have to go out and price test, determine, I guess your pricing sensitivity, that your elasticity of demand, stuff like that?
It's a great question, one for which, having done this before, you never have the answer. So you're going to have to take a lot of uncertainty and information and make a gut call. I was involved with the launch of a drug called Epivir in HIV, which worked alongside with Retrovir or AZT, had synergistic benefits. And at the time, there was a lot of political turmoil over pricing of AZT, so we underpriced Epivir, left a lot of money on the table. And ultimately, Epivir went on to be used in over 75% of all patients with HIV. We left arguably about $1 billion on the table over the course of the product lifetime. Company called, another company launched another drug called Sestiva, and they priced it high because they had great data showing value. They went on a risk curve, priced it above the existing price bands, and had a lot of turmoil, but then they showed that, hey, this stuff works great. And they went on to be used in over 50% of new patients getting antiretroviral therapy for HIV. So I guess the answer to your question is, there is no formula. There is risk involved. These are decisions that make or break careers in the pharmaceutical and in the device world. But one where you go in with assumptions and you go in knowing how people are likely to respond, and then companies have to make a judgment call. But ultimately, if you say that the incremental cost is $20,000 and you want to charge $20,000 for your product, well, chances are you don't work 100% of the time, and you're not leaving any wiggle room running the table, so to speak. And it's just not feasible, not realistic.
That makes sense. Appreciate it.
Other questions?
Anything else for Tom? I thought that was a very nice overview, Tom. Thanks very much.
Thank you.